suddenly everyone is interested in Ukraine, and
the D&D is a game for those people who don't understand the importance of role playing.
And Kazakhs and Salo and Horilka, and voila, you have Ukrainian setting. But Lviv was it's a cradle of World of Darkness kind of community in Ukraine. So mostly I think people are calling Game Master as a Veduchий.
Hello, I'm Jan from Dobre Rzuty, and with me today is...
I'm Oleksandr Trifan. I'm from Ukraine, and I'm trying to be an active member of Ukrainian tabletop role-playing community in general. I'm a founder of the tabletop RPG publishing in Ukraine called 87 Games, which is focusing on mostly indie and small press games and indie authors, and also some in-house projects, of course. And I was a part of big streaming channel called Вечерние Кости. The channel is closed currently, but we were doing streaming for 5 years in a row, I guess. And we grew up from, 7 viewers on Twitch and up to, 1,000 viewers in a peak moments when we were doing some premieres and things like that. I guess it's, for us, it was a big achievement. So that's why I'm calling those numbers. But yeah, that's in general about me. And I'm also a game designer doing my games and trying to help our Ukrainian community to develop and, grow and be active.
Okay. Thank you. We'll make a short disclaimer for every viewer. We're recording that material in March of 2033, so we're more than a year into the Russian invasion on Ukraine, which is the part of the war that started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. We're recording that when there is, a stalemate on front, but the war is still going on.
Kind of.
And we're hoping that from the viewers from future that war ended with the only one ending, so the victory of Ukraine. So some topics will be considering that problem, but mostly the future and the impact of that special situation. But that's for later. First, we will talk about Ukraine as a country, because not all of our viewers might have proper understanding and informations about that part of the world. So what can you say about your country?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting topic, and I guess I'm not the only one, and there is a lot of people like me currently, Ukrainians, who are rediscovering their own country from scratch, because things that happened, right, made us all reevaluate the identity, right, and what it means to be a Ukrainian, and to take a look again at the country's history and culture and things like that. But yeah, suddenly everyone is interested in Ukraine, and we went through, starting from the what's Ukraine? It's part of Russia, or what something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And to this thing that now people suddenly realize that there is a whole separate country with its own culture and language. And
yes, and Ukraine is a big country. Now,
yeah, it's a big country. I mean, it was the largest in Europe in terms of population and the area. But currently, with all of the migration because of the war, I guess Poland is probably now bigger than Ukraine.
It's probably
in terms of population.
But as every big country, there's a differences. You're from the western part of Ukraine, and there is
the most western part.
Yes, there is a big difference between the western parts, the mid parts, this near Dnieper, and the eastern parts of Ukraine. And do you think that this have any sort of impact on RPGs during the whole history of independent Ukraine? That there are...
It's an interesting thing. Well, I guess probably yes. Probably geographical regions or geographical positioning has some impact on how tabletop role-playing scene was developing in Ukraine. I would say that in Uzhgorod, that's my hometown, which is the most western part of Ukraine. It's a region called Zakarpattia, and it became part of Ukraine only after the Second World War. Before that, it was everything. It was Czechoslovakia, it was Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was everything else except Ukraine before the war. And my grandfather, grandfather, he has three different nationalities in his passports. Like he had three different passports without ever moving anywhere. So that's in short about that region. And it always been kind of, I don't know, like a backwater, on the outskirts of everything. So I would even say that probably there was no tabletop role-playing gaming scene in that region specifically before maybe 2015-ish, maybe, I don't know. That's when big things started happening, like Stranger Things, then popular media, Critical Role, things like, I don't know, some episodes of Big Bang Theory. Suddenly people realized that, okay, there is this thing called Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not sure what it is, but I like board games, so I will try it, right? So then probably some groups appeared there. But in the same time, if we will take a look at big cities like Lviv or Kharkiv or Kiev or Odessa, because those cities are more of like globalized kind of cities, right? And there are just more things happening there. I would say that role-playing games appeared there much earlier than in Uzhgorod. I know some people from Lviv actually started playing probably mid-90s. I was actually doing a video podcast just recently, and I hope it will be released soon, with frontman of the Ukrainian metal band called 1914. It's a black metal band that is World War One themed, and he's actually a game master, and he started playing in 98, I guess. And I know some people started even earlier, maybe like mid 90s, as mid 90s, as I was saying. Same thing, Kharkiv, because it's a very big, like a university city, and there was a lot of students from probably from the most eastern part of Ukraine. And again, it was close to the Russian border, and there was this informational exchange, right, with Moscow maybe and big cities in Russia, and probably that's where tabletop role playing scene was also developing independently. Same Kiev, right? So if we're talking about big cities, role playing gaming scene was developing probably mid 90s. If we're talking about smaller backwater kind of places, then it's probably mid 2000s. But in terms of how the geographical location influenced tabletop role-playing gaming scene, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that there was a big difference. Well, actually there was. Lviv was it's a cradle of World of Darkness kind of community in Ukraine. So for some reason, Lviv is this node where everything connected World of this is gathering, right? It was a big place for LARPing related to World of Darkness. Then I know a lot of gaming sessions and campaigns started there, originated there. A lot of people that were playing World of Darkness and Lviv, like different games like from World of Darkness.
It's funny. It's funny because in Poland, Krakow is the place where there was a strong community of Legends of the Five Rings. And
really?
It's called even the Krakow School of Gameplay. It's very... It's like a meme now, but it used to concentrate on, immersive gaming in proper clothes and everything like that. So they drinking tea during the sessions. They were very serious about it. So it looks like some, I don't know, Galicia thing in the history terms.
Okay.
So there is a Krakow and there is a Wolf, and those places that concentrate those serious players.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know what's the reason. And I was also thinking about Lviv, as you're saying, or Lviv,
You just say
Ukrainian way.
your way, because
Yeah.
in Polish, for a non-Polish
Yeah,
person,
I know.
in Ukrainian it's Lviv, in Polish it's Lvov.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's
So I was thinking about that, and I'm just thinking that Lviv is more. It just helps building this kind of more gothic kind of atmosphere because the city itself is more historical, while Kiev and Kharkiv and other big cities to the east are more industrialized and more influenced by Soviets, right? So there is not a lot of this historical background. I mean, there is, of course, there is, and those are old cities, especially Kiev, but it just feels different, right? And Lviv with all of this architecture and just understanding that this is an old city with beautiful architecture helps to immerse yourself in this more moody kind of game.
especially
While
in World of Darkness.
yes, exactly. And Kiev, Kharkiv, those are I guess more like Dungeons and Dragons kind of places.
And what was the source of RPG material in Ukraine? So it came from in Poland in the 90s. There was 4 years or 5 years when there came all the big games: Warhammer First Edition, World of Darkness, and what is interesting, the first World of Darkness game in Poland was a werewolf, and just after
Okay,
werewolf was
that's
the
weird.
vampire, and then Cyberpunk and D&D with. And that's interesting. On D&D didn't stuck in Poland. It just faded away. And third edition get some fans, but the AD&D just nobody. I don't know. I know one person that played one session of AD&D and says that is everything that they don't want to do in RPGs. So it was the least influential system in Poland. But there was the 5 years when all major systems were published. And I know how it's in Ukraine. Is there?
Interesting. No, I guess in Ukraine it's very different. And the beginnings of tabletop role playing scene in Ukraine, as I mentioned, was probably mid 90s. And it was almost like a very underground kind of thing, almost like a cult like thing. Mostly it originated from literature conventions. People who were reading science fiction and fantasy were meeting there, talking to each other, exchanging books, exchanging knowledge, basically, because internet wasn't a thing back then, right? And I guess that's where the first wave of tabletop role-playing kind of happened. And I guess that was AD&D, probably AD&D. I don't think there was anything else at that moment. And there was no translations, obviously, and there is no D&D translation yet. But even these days, there is nothing. And people were doing their fan translations and doing this thing called in post-Soviet region. I mean, Oikumena, it was called Samizdat.
Samizdat.
So basically, yeah. So it's basically like self-publishing, DIY self-publishing. So what people were doing, they were scanning the pages of the books and then reprinting them, or they were doing the translations with like old school typing machines, and then also reprinting and copying them and also binding them and making those DIY books, basically. It was very obscure and weird experience because those translations weren't full. They were not really correct from time to time. There was a lot of misunderstandings there. I know one guy that was actually asking his friends in university at the faculty of like foreign languages, right? He was asking his friends to help him with translations. And usually, people that are not related to the topic, even though they are good in knowing other languages, they will do translation without a context. So a lot of things will be lost there, right? Or misinterpreted. So yeah, it was the beginning, I guess. And then internet became more widespread and people started looking for the stuff. I guess second big thing was fan translations for the World of Darkness, and the first publishing of D&D. It was 3.5, maybe 3.0. I don't remember correctly. It was translated into Russian officially. And there was a book, and there was probably even 3 books, if I remember correctly. And those were scanned and pirated, of course. So it was the like a second big wave, and that's when also generic universal role-playing system also became a thing. So GURPS, I guess it was the 4th edition. Maybe at that point it was the 3rd edition, I guess. So yeah, it probably these things were the biggest. So Dungeons and Dragons, of course, World of Darkness, and Vampire. First of all, I mean, Vampire is a cult basically. Then GURPS, and what else? You know what? I don't think there is anything else that was that big in Ukraine, and actually in other post-Soviet countries, including Russia.
Okay, so
like these 3 things were the biggest.
And were there translation to Ukrainian? Because many people know Russian or they knew Russian. So were the books imported just to Ukraine or pirated via, I don't know, scanning them full? Because were there any Ukrainian translations of the RPG's book?
Talking about Ukrainian translations, probably only those like Samizdat DIY translations from the 90s and maybe early 2000s. That's the only Ukrainian translations that I know about and that were there for sure. Otherwise, mostly it was Russian translations because yes, almost everyone could read and understand Russian. So it wasn't a problem to understand it, right? And yeah, so I guess everyone was just using Russian translations. And those first books, the whole thing was like a catastrophe. This first publishing of 3.5 or 3.0 in Russian, because they sold some books, and that's it, and the whole thing just disappeared. So I guess it was a financial catastrophe for a publisher who signed this deal, right? But those books were pirated, of course. They were scanned, and I guess that was also like one of the sources. And the Ukrainian translations are actually a big problem because there was nothing like for a very long time. There was nothing basically, and only now some translations started to appear. And I know some of the bigger publishers, especially those who are working with board games, started doing the translations, like official translations for some bigger things like Savage Worlds, Call of Cthulhu, and yeah, those 2 I remember for sure, but otherwise don't know. Regarding the Dungeons and Dragons translation, it's a big problem because initially the license for the whole region was sold to a company in Russia called Hobby World. It's a giant publisher, board game publisher, and they also acquired some of the RPG licenses, including Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, and they actually bought the license for the whole region, including Ukraine. So for a long time, if you were a publisher in Ukraine and you had money to buy the license, you were not able to do that because the license is already bought by Russian company. So there was no Ukrainian translation. I hope that things will change, but I know that it's a very like a complicated process because initially the like licenses for the translation and localization were managed by a company called Gale Force 9, not the Wizards of the Coast themselves. And then there was this lawsuit between these 2 companies, and I'm not sure if this whole publishing thing goes under the same rules as it was before. So we'll see.
So when you were preparing, I know, sessions for your channel and for your streaming services, you were using mostly English text, as I understand, and for some games sometimes Russian, because I saw on your channel that, for example, the Blades in the Dark, there was a Klinki во тьме, so that one was, but mostly I understand you have to know English to play RPGs, or at least one person at the table have to have understanding of that language to just play and to describe everything and
language knowledge is a big benefit for the gaming tables in Ukraine, of course, because if just GM or one of the players knows English, it makes things a lot more easier, because then you have an access to everything, right? Because otherwise you need to look only for those translated games, like in Russian probably. So yeah, well, it was how things were like 2-3 years ago. Right now things are changing a lot, and a lot of people are actually, if there is no Ukrainian translation and there is a Russian translation of the game, they will still try to struggle and read the English translation with a translator instead of using Russian translation.
Yes,
so
it's obvious now. But one question, because you say the GM, what do you call game master in Ukrainian?
Okay, I don't think. Well, that's an interesting topic, and we were actually discussing it with the musician that I was mentioning.
Because I understand
earlier.
You were talking about on your podcasts, so it was just the same. But in Poland, it's MG, mistrz gry.
MG, mistrz gry. Well, in Ukraine, we don't have a standard name for the game master. I mean, there is no tradition, I would say. There is no dictionary that was developed, right? It's a separate topic, but if you will ask me about, at what stage currently the Ukrainian scene is, I would say it's a fetus. It's still a fetus. It's still like embryo phase of development, because there is a lot of people, but the whole movement is not mature enough, and there is no traditions. I mean, or those traditions are very localized and not widespread, right? So because this whole thing was mostly like a cargo cult, right? The tabletop RPG thing in general in post-Soviet countries, it was like a cargo cult, because while on the West the thing was evolving naturally, here it was mostly a copying of things that are happening there without actually this step-by-step natural process. So because of that, we don't have this tradition of calling game masters something specifically. And if you will go through different tables, you will hear different things like ведучий. It's basically like a facilitator, let's call it that way. Yeah, or you will hear something like maybe GAM, which is GM, game master, or well, there are different things, but mostly I think people are calling game master as a ведучий. It's Ukrainian word for mostly that word for for it.
And the other names from the other games, for example, in World of Darkness, I don't know, it's narrator or something like that.
Well,
because, for example, in Polish, that all those names from those fancy names from the systems, they just don't stick. Everyone is just MG, and that's understandable for everyone. And there is a prowadzący, which is the same as ведучий. So, which is this big basket when you're, for example, talking with someone playing World of Darkness, or you used to, because I know the problem is a bad word, but it was important at the beginning of the century. There was this big, I will call it, walls between these groups. For example, when you play World of Darkness, you won't play D&D, because the D&D is a game for those people who do not understand the importance of role-playing and all that other stuff. And this game was much more edgy. It gets edgier and edgier for some time, until the World of Darkness line just died off with Chronicle of Darkness thing. And it somehow killed the World of Darkness. Now, for 2 years, we got a 5th edition translation in Polish, and the game came back with the crowdfunding, got the recognition, but it is far from that what was, I don't know, 15 years ago when the World of Darkness was really big player. Now, for example, in Poland, the biggest player is Call of Cthulhu. There's everyone knows it, everyone plays it. It's now is the most important game. And was there in Ukraine the game that none other games, when you're calling the game, you're meaning RPGs. In Poland, it was first to play Warhammer, and that's mean to play RPGs. For example, I didn't know the name. I first played Warhammer, and just 2 years after that, I just learned that there is an RPGs, and this whole it's like I was playing a Doom game on PC. The Warhammer, and was in Ukraine that situation that the one game was such a big deal for everyone.
No, I think that first of all, same thing in Ukraine with World of Darkness community. It was very gate-kept and very edgy, of course. And for some reason, it was, there was this attitude that, we are playing role-playing games. You are playing just games, right? It was something like that. And I have a lot of funny stories when, talking to those people. For example, there was this, I remember I was talking to one girl, and she was a very big defender of everything World of Darkness. And we were talking about some concept for the game, and she was like, no, it's possible only with World of Darkness, like Storyteller engine. I was like, why? Because only that engine allows you for a real role play. I was like, it doesn't make a lot of sense here. It just dies. I mean, anything. You could play serious drama even with Dungeons and Dragons or lasers and feelings, or the system where you have two stats. Basically, it doesn't matter. It not helps. I mean, it's just a system. It's just a framework, right?
Mm-hmm. And for me, it's interesting question. How serious was the RPG community in Ukraine at all? So was there most of players were just playing for fun, or was this an ambition in role playing in Ukraine?
Well, I think it very depends on, first of all, what you were playing, because as I just mentioned, for World of Darkness community, it's more than just a game, right? Of course. But other than that, I think that those tables that were starting in the 90s, especially the people that came from LARPing or were mixed with LARPing, I've heard the stories that people were very serious about their games. You need a dedication if you're sitting at the table for 10 or 12 hours. I assume that means that you need to be very into the game to be able to sit there for 10 or 12 hours. I mean, for me personally, I was doing some maybe 6 to 7 hours session with my friends, but it's exhausting. It's an exhausting experience, right? And I don't think I was able to sit more than that at one game. And people were playing for 10, 12 hours. And people were also doing costumes for the games. So for some tables, it was very real, right? For other people, I guess for most of the scene right now, it's just more about playing the game. It's more about having fun with friends and just rolling some dice, killing some orcs, things like that. At the same time, there was the channel, right? The streams that we were doing. We were doing a show, basically. It wasn't just your kitchen game where you could pause, have a break, smoke a cigarette, or take a pee or something like that. It was 4 hours. Okay, guys, we're doing a job right now. It's a show. We need to be focused, and it should be interesting for the people who are watching us. Our games were not prescripted, but when you have this mature players and experienced players, and you know each other very well because you're friends, you're very, very close community of friends, and you're playing one or twice every week for 5 years, you could feel each other without talking, right? So because of that, we were able to do these very dramatic things at the table with a high immersion, and for some games it was very immersive. I mean, you could feel the atmosphere at the table, and there were real emotions, especially with Dasha, that I was doing the podcast earlier. She was getting really emotional. I mean, she was getting those real emotions when she was playing sometimes, and there were some tears at the table when we were ending up our first campaign in a D&D that we were playing for like 3 years, I guess, and we ended with like 17 level characters, or like 15 to 17 level characters.
It is this Agni.
It was before that. It was called like Visniki Buri. It's like a Heralds of the Storm. Like very,
very
name.
D&D name.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But it was like a prototype for this whole setting and the world that we then explored in the second campaign called Ogni, which is like embers or fires, basically. Yeah. So, yeah, we were playing this campaign, and there was a last session, people were genuinely crying, and the guys were crying at the table. I mean, it was very like important and touching for all of us to close this story. And the whole community that was gathered around the channel and our streams were influenced by what they were seeing. And I've noticed that a lot of people are trying to emulate like this kind of play, and also teach their players to be very immersive and invested into the game, like being very in the role during the game and things like that. I mean, is that good? I'm not sure. I mean, yes, of course, quality of your games you're increasing the quality of feedback that you're getting as a GM, and also the investment from the players. But in the same time, people are also forgetting that this is just a game, and the main point is just having fun in the end. So I guess there should be this balance between things, right? Like being very serious and into the game, and then just having fun, and then also not forgetting that shows on YouTube are shows on YouTube, and they're actually made to entertain you, right?
Yeah.
So
what was behind this system that you played D&D and not the other game? Because I understand that the D&D campaigns were the biggest on your channel.
It was.
Is that the system is recognizable, or maybe it's just because you like it?
Yeah, well, me personally, I'm not a big fan of the 5th edition, to be honest. But I was playing with my friends, and well, the thing was, when I joined the channel, it was just the second episode of the whole thing. And my friend back then, Vitaly, I mean, we were like friends from, back then. Then we were not communicating for a couple of years, maybe 10 years even. And then he suddenly reached out to me and saying just, hey, I know you're into this thing called D&D. We're trying to play here. I was like, well, not really D&D, but I'm playing role-playing games, but whatever. Yeah, I will join you, of course. And we started playing. And that was just that, we started playing D&D because everyone just started playing D&D, and there was no reason for that. And it wasn't because the game was popular. It wasn't because it was something that we really liked or something like that. It was just, that's
just
the
happened.
game that everyone knows. Yeah, that just happened. And then it wasn't the biggest if we're talking about the stats of the channel, right? But it was ongoing. Like for 5 years, almost every week we had a D&D session happening with like these two big campaigns. And I guess that was this, red line that crosses all of the things that we were doing, because we were also playing World of Darkness games. They were also big, and probably in terms of stats, they were even higher than the D&D campaign. Because when we were launching the premiere of the new campaign in this World of Darkness setting that we were doing, because we had this like we were calling it like Blood Scum verse or something like that, because the first campaign that we were playing, Vampire the Masquerade, was called Blood Scum, and then the Demon the Fallen and Mage the Ascension followed up after the Vampire the Masquerade, and we played a couple of seasons there, and it was also a big thing. And when we were launching a premiere of the new story in this universe, I guess it was Demon the Fallen, we had probably like more than 1,000 viewers at that point on Twitch, and it was like, wow. I mean, it was a lot. It was incredible for us.
I'm looking through YouTube and I see that the Bloodscams, they get, I don't know, 20,000 viewers on YouTube after the streaming goes. So
yeah. I guess the first episodes were on YouTube. They gathered like around like first episodes always are gathering more than others, right? And for the first episodes, we were hitting like 50,000 sometimes or something like that. So now, anyway, D&D was lower than that, but nevertheless, it was like always like 500 and then dropping to 300 viewers for the stream. So at the start, you have like 500-600. In the end of the stream, you will have like something like 300. We started just because like there was no intention behind that. But then we figured out that D&D basically equals role-playing games for a lot of people. So that was also a marketing thing, of course.
Maybe it's connected with that you said that this stage of the hobby is in the fetus state, that when I looking at the channel Wieczornie Kości, there is D&D, there are sessions in the mainstream systems, and at the same time you're looking at, I don't know, some OSR games or really small indie systems that are in Poland. It's that when you want to get a bigger channel, you're just going mainly for mainstream. You play a Call of Cthulhu, maybe Cult, maybe sometimes you go on the shores like, I don't know, 2D20 systems, but that's all. And there is the big separation between the indie and OSR games and these mainline systems. And on your channel, there was everything. You can maybe the sessions were mostly in the big systems, but your everything that you thought was about these small games. In Poland, as I said, on the same channel, when you get looking at Morgborg and or Old School Essentials and D&D or other games, this is very uncommon. Are there any really indie games scene in Ukraine, or if you're interested in RPGs, you're just interested in RPGs, and sometime there will be OSR or indie players and only the players of the mainstream systems?
Well, good question. Well, first of all, there is this distinction between mainstream things and let's call it indie, right? There is D&D, there is Call of Cthulhu, there is Pathfinder also, kind of a big thing. What else? Well, Vampire the Masquerade, World of Darkness, things like that. But then, regarding the indie things or OSR, well, Morgborg is kind of popular, but at this time, I'm not sure if you could call Morgborg really an indie game, because it's just a hit, right? I mean, they quickly grew up from the indie kind of thing, and it's mostly, I would call it mainstream currently. I don't know. Well, I mean, very limited, but still kind of a mainstream. So people are playing Morgborg. There are some enthusiasts that are building these small OSR communities, but it's not widespread and it's not really popular. And even in very big communities, they're mostly D&D focused. If someone mentions something like Labyrinth Lord or Old School Essentials or, I don't know, like Swords and Wizardry, right? People will be like, what? Like what it is. I don't know what it is. So even in the big communities, people are not really into like these things, and it's still very uncommon, and it's still very like, I don't know, it's not on the surface, right? And if you're looking for these things, you will find these like small focused communities, and then you will suddenly figure out that there is a whole world of small games that are actually better written and working better than 5th edition. Right? They were like, wow, Worlds Without Number, wow, I didn't knew that
Yes, this is
it's there,
one
right?
of those books that give you some sort of RPG revelations. Is that
Yeah.
all Without Number series? And you're trying to go to this more indie scene, because I looked at your system, Cavalry, and a lot of people were making their feedback for that system. You put this
Yeah.
open document, and everyone could put their thoughts into it. So there are
Mhm.
people interested in this part of hobby.
Yeah, well, part of the thing is I've actually tried to use this momentum that I still got from the channel. Channel was closed, but there was a lot of people who were still interested in, okay, guys, what are you doing now, right? Maybe you will, create a new channel or something like that. And actually, Cavalry, it also started during the days of the channel, right? So there was this small community that was interested in the game. And then, it's a long story how I actually decided to get back to Cavalry after the war started, because initially when the war started, I was like, you know, I'm not interested in this hobby. It doesn't make sense for me anymore. Like I, I don't have a module for this. Like I just can't, right? Because other things are more important. But then 6 months afterwards, I was like, okay, I was into this hobby for like almost 20 years, and I will not let these pigs to kill my enjoyment for the hobby, right? So I've got back into it, and I've decided to like relaunch basically Cavalry again, and I've made an announcement. I launched the Telegram channel for the game, and suddenly there was like this, wow, yeah, let's talk about your game. And so people came back, and then the more people came back to the game, they were also like preaching about the game in those like small local communities, and people were like, what's that? I'm interested in that, right? So more people were coming, and yeah, then I've made this thing available, and I wasn't marketing it as an OSR game, because for a lot of people, and especially in Ukrainian tabletop RPG scene right now, OSR is not a word like what it is. People don't know what it is, so why you need to market it as an OSR? Even though I'm not calling it an OSR, maybe OSR-like game, because it's not really following. I mean, it follows the principles of game design and the philosophy of game design that is kind of OSR-like, but it's not the OSR game. It's not retro clone. So then I've made this thing, and I was like, hey, I'm doing a game for you, and it's available for everyone. You could support me on Patreon if you want, but here's the game. You don't need to pay for it. And I'm still working on it. It's a draft, so come and play and leave your feedback. And yeah, people got interested. And then afterwards, I decided to create this publishing, right? RPG publishing. And my thought was, okay, I will do this as an umbrella for all of my smaller projects in addition to Cavalry, and also like new ideas that potentially I will do after the Cavalry will be released. But then also I realized that, okay, there are a lot of people who are actually doing their games, and like small games, like maybe one-page game or like a brochure kind of a game or things like that. Other people are doing big games. Like there is a guy in Kiev, he's Anton, his name, and he's doing like a passion project for like 10 years. It's called Archeterica, and it's a game about like a conspiracy and occult conspiracy kind of thing in the Napoleonic era, basically. So like very gentlemanish conspiracy and occult game. And it's like almost 600 pages long. I mean, it's a huge book. And he's doing that for 10 years. So, and I was like, okay, people are doing their stuff, right? And no one actually knows about that because, again, there are no platforms, there are no big communication channels for the creators to get known, and for people who are interested in tabletop role-playing, they don't have an ability to learn about all of those smaller things that are also available. So because of that, you have this cult of D&D for the newcomers into the hobby, because for them that's the game. Like, they don't know about anything else, so that's why they are not interested about anything else. So, and then I decided that, okay, maybe I will help these people, like these creators, to actually be visible for the community. And that was my goal with this publishing.
It's interesting because this is some sort of the resurgent, as you said, you're giving the material, for example, in Ukrainian. So it's more available for just people speaking that language or wanted to using it, because it's understandable that some people that were speaking Russian because they know that language now, it's the last thing they want to do in that situation. So it's some way to go out from this fetus state to the next level of the hobby. And with this Napoleonic War, is the historical setting popular in Ukraine during play, or the history is important? 'Cause the same in Poland, for a long time, the historical accuracy was very big thing. You were playing Warhammer, okay, but you got to know something about the Holy Roman Empire, because if you don't know, you're just bad. So there was this going back to the historical roots. There was also the RPG system called Dzikie Pola about the in the climate, but it was really from the, let's call it, Polish perspective. So you play only nobles. Everyone is not important. There are only nobles. They fighting with sabers. Not a good system, but with the very Polish-centric perspective on that problem. But the history was always a thing. If you're playing something in history, for example, Call of Cthulhu, you have to prepare something about, I don't know, the 20s or the 30s. And was it in Ukraine important for the players to from the other parts? Because many of the Polish players were also history nerds, I can say.
Yeah. Well, this first wave that was happening alongside the LARPing scene and also like these fantasy and science fiction literature nerds, right? Or geeks. That's where this historical accuracy was very important, because we even have this term for these kind of people. We are calling them, well, it's same in Russian and Ukrainian, zaklopochniki, which is basically people who are counting the rivets on the armor. Because on those LARPing events, there were always these people that were looking at your plate or armor and were like, these rivets are actually from the 15th century, while your armor is typically like 13th century armor. Like, why? Right? So, and then that became a thing, right? And yeah, so definitely for this earlier wave of playing, historical accuracy was a thing. I'm not sure if that was very important, but to some degree, yeah. Now, I don't think it's an important aspect of gaming, because people are mostly playing like D&D, and D&D is an abstract by itself. It's not doing a good job with reflecting all of the, small details of armor or weaponry or things like that, right? You have universal AC for the whole set of plate armor, and that's it, right? So yeah, people are not really into like this historical accuracy, but in the same time, you will have a lot of these guys who are, developing their own D&D, but better, because, I don't like how armor is treated in a D&D, or I want to have random locations for hits, right? I want to hit hand or your head or things like that, or there is no critical injuries table in D&D, so I will build my own. And you're like, yeah, you could try Warhammer, So
And you're talking about LARPing community. Is that community bigger than RPGs? On it was before? Is it popular somehow?
definitely older, and I know there were big events. I was not a part of that scene. I wasn't there. I've not been to any of these events, but I know there are large events, and I know there are people who are spending shit ton of money on proper costumes, cosplay. Not the cosplay, but the craft, right? For if you're playing not the regular, I don't know, like a fighter, but you're playing specifically a chief of a like Chaos Marauders warband. If you're playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay or something like that. So people will spend a lot on their costumes and all of that. So there is definitely a community. It's an old one. I mean, community is really old, and there are events, and people are also taking part in larger European events. I know, like in Poland specifically, I know a lot of Ukrainian LARPers are actually attending those events in Poland and also in like the rest of Europe, especially World of Darkness themed things, also Harry Potter kind of things. So yeah, that's a big movement and community. And you know what? Interesting thing is definitely there is an overlap. A lot of LARPers are playing role-playing games and vice versa. But other than that, these two are like two different worlds.
Okay.
Being a LARPer doesn't mean you're into role-playing games and other way around.
It's interesting. I don't know. I'm not a specialist of that topic in Poland, so I won't tell. But it's interesting that it's older hobby.
Yeah.
That is very specific. But someone thinks connected. We got this part of the questions that to treat the Ukraine as a RPG setting. What you can tell us about that? Because when you think that you want, I know, to make a location or an NPC that will be 100% Ukrainian, like a game to quickly create Ukraine as an RPG.
Yeah, of course. I guess, if we will delve into the historical settings and things that are the most recognizable for like everywhere around, definitely anyone will name Cossacks, right? Like, of course, what else? But in the same time, there are a lot of different historical periods that are very interesting and that are very significant for the history and the culture. And you could call like Vagranians, right? Like a birth of the Kievan Rus. And all of those first, right?
Yes,
of Kievan Rus.
I've got the idea. Traveled grasslands, but with Varangians on those rivers. They trying to get to Constantinople. So
yeah, exactly. It's actually a really good idea, to be honest. Well, and then there is also like times of Sarmatians or Scythians, which is also very interesting and not that explored. And to be honest, if you're into history, this Kievan Rus thing is very significant, but also it's hard to imagine something more Ukrainian than Sarmatians, for example, because it was a long period of time and their culture was very influential. And even now, if you will take a look at these like scandals regarding the historical treasures that were stolen from Ukraine, like through the history, it's mostly Sarmatian gold and things like that, right? So yeah, those things are very interesting if we will take a look at the historical settings, and they will be very interesting to play, I would say. Now when we are talking, I'm imagining this like sandbox hex crawl game in the like Sarmatian period or Scythian period, with all of these tribes and war chiefs and things like that, and it should be very interesting, right? And also the Greek influence, things like that, because you have Black Sea and all of the colonies, Greek colonies, so it should be interesting. Yeah.
But when I think the thing that's common is these steppes, all these big flat grasslands. I think they're typical for Ukraine, but also typical for thinking about that country. But for example, you from the part of the country that is mostly mountains, and it's for me interesting because Poland now, maybe not now, because with all the Ukrainians go to Poland, it will change. But after the Second World War, was very homogeneous country. But in the Ukraine, I think that it was different. It's hard to find only this sign that will be common for all people. Maybe now it's more common, but I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, it will be harder to find something that was common for them.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm not a historian here, and I will not try to pretend I know all of these like very complicated and interconnected things throughout the history regarding all of these different cultural groups that were living here, because it's very complicated. I mean, it's super complicated. Even now for Ukrainian historians and for the Ukrainian culture, it's a big, like a, thing to unravel, like this whole, even with a language, like there is, of course, there is a Ukrainian language, but then you will see all of these differences about how people are speaking. I mean, it's everywhere like that. In Poland, the same. You will have those different variations of your own language here and there, and sometimes people will not understand each other if they will go hardcore into their local dialect. At least from where I'm from in Zakarpattia, we have this local variation or like dialect of Ukrainian language, which is completely different. It's so different that, let's say, people from Lviv, when they're visiting, it's western part of Ukraine. It should be connected, right? People should understand each other. But in the mountains, if you will go to the village and people will start talking to you, probably you will not understand them. And the funny part is that even people from different villages in the Zakarpattia region will also not understand each other, because some village was, for example, settled with German settlers from Swabia, and other village is completely Hungarian village, and the third village will be completely village settlers from Romania, for example. Others will be Slovaks, right? And because of that, these local sub-local variations were also evolving in the same time. It's such a mixing pot of all of these languages, and you will hear a lot of German, Slovak, Romanian, Hungarian words there. And also, of course, Ukrainian. Some we have also this minority called Ne, which is like a weird bunch, but their language is also it's like a old Slavic ish kind of, but not really. And then a lot of Polish words, like, my grandfather was always saying when he was walking around the house, he was saying that he goes for spacer. And you're like, okay, now that makes sense, right? So yeah, or fotel. It was always the word for the couch in my family. Yeah, So it's a weird kind of thing. And then the breakfast was always Frühstück, which is German, right? So yeah, so then you have this thing, and the culture here is completely different. So when we are going back to, if we will go back to the idea of how these things culturally could be represented as a setting or a game, my dream is actually to do, when I will have time for that, to do a third-party supplement for, let's say, Vaesen role-playing game with Carpathian mythology, and also like these, like beginning of the century or the 20th century, those times were also very interesting and very dynamic in this region, because you will have all of these different cultures and political situation is very complex. So it's a really interesting setting, I would say, and it would be interesting not only for local gamers, right? Because it's Carpathian mythology, it's a, should be local thing, but because people are trying to reopen their own culture again, a lot of gamers from, let's say, Kharkiv, which other side of the country, they will be super interested to learn about that and to see that, and there is a lot of opportunities now for these kind of things. But in the same time, I would also like to mention that whenever we are talking about historical, like proper historical and cultural representation of Ukrainian culture, I guess it's the same thing with every kind of historical and cultural representation. You need to be very careful to do that with taste, right? And not being, because it's easy to do like all of these sharavare, like the pants, right? That people wearing, and Cossacks and Salo and Horilka, and voila, you have Ukrainian setting. But it would be a sign of a bad taste, let's call it that way. So
Yes, and I think that the important thing for the good taste in that situation is to think about the maybe issues or themes that are important. Because when we are talking off screen, we said that the Ukraine is the land with the history with a lot of struggles about
yeah,
many situations. And do you think that this could be an important part of that sort of setting to emphasize that the problem of this, no, the country that was many times, let's say, partitions or different parts were the parts of
yeah,
other countries, and now they are in the one country with all those traditions and all way of thinking about themselves. Because I presume that the Ukrainians from West have or had maybe before the war, because it will change everything. So before the
yeah,
invasion, because the war started
yeah,
much earlier, has a different thought about their neighbors, as you said, from Kharkov and the people
yeah.
from. So does the struggle is some part or can be some part of those, let's call it, Ukrainian setting in RPG, or and how to emphasize it?
Yeah, I think definitely it could be there. Also, a theme of resistance is very important, I guess, for the like in general for the culture and history of the nation, right? The resistance is always like, I guess, a big theme always. Even if you take a look at literature, for example. But yeah, in the same time, the struggle, all of these historical moments where there was a lot of uncertainty and new rules, or from this morning you're living in a different country, like all of these things could be played really well. But in the same time, you need to be, again, very careful, I guess, with those things, because a lot of times these topics are also related to the tragedies, right? And topics that are, again, very sensitive in a lot of ways. For example, if we will take a look at the Western Ukraine, right, and the situation, the tragedy that was happening in Volyn,
Hmm.
right? Like, for example, those things. And if you will do one thing wrong, both sides will hate you for that,
Yes,
right?
it's easier to get to enemies than to get to friends in that
Yes.
situation. Yes, so, but for me, this is also the big well of ideas and the true ideas and the true problems. Because okay, funny, when we are talking about the true RPGs and the World of Darkness, it's somehow harder when we put the problems in only fantasy setting with no real connections. Of course you can
Yeah.
get the emotions, but it's easier to relate it to something. So that I think that the World
Hmm.
of Darkness get its vibe because it's in our world and it's mostly
Yeah.
concentrated on the problems of that world and the problems of power and all that things.
Of
And
course.
it's
Yeah.
different when you think what to think about the killing goblins, because they are goblins. You never
Yeah.
saw a goblin, you saw the other person with the problem. So I think that, of course, that the countries with the rich history, maybe every country got a rich history, but these countries that
Yeah.
history is not the mainstream history. And now we see that the Ukraine is one of those countries, because the number of the videos on YouTube about Ukraine in that year, it's
Yeah.
taken
It's exploding.
everything.
Yeah.
And it's good because it's a big country in Europe, and to think, oh, that's a part
Mhm.
of Russia, it was ever insulting for the people. But for me, maybe you will correct me, there is a strange need for freedom in Ukrainians. I think it's different than the same need in Poles, because the Poles got their need of freedom, but the Ukrainians got, they say this. I don't want to call it, but the Cossacks are interesting team, not in context that they had this Osewedets and the
Yeah.
Sharavari, and you look like a Cossack, you're a warrior, but somehow they are the cowboys of the East, but on
Yeah.
some level they are also the Native Americans of the East at the same moment.
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
interesting
Exactly.
that they're people from that place, but the with this special form of thinking that is now, and it's make those interesting team for me, as I can say, as I know, of course, because I'm just I like history, but it's different to know history and to live in the culture that embrace some sort of
Yeah, it's a very good notion, right? And if we'll take a look even at the like iconic pieces of literature or cinema, doesn't matter, depicting Kazakh history or things like that, like Taras Bulba, for example, right? Or Ogniem i Mechem, right? You will see these stories regarding Kazakhs, right? Where they want to be on a good side, right? And they want to make things that are good, right? And for the freedom and everything good, right? But in the end, it's almost like, they're always on a loser's side, right? They're always tricked, and it all always ends with a tragedy.
Yes, this tragical notion. For me, I can say that in Shevchenko's Haidamaki, it is this problem when there is those Sotnik Gonta, and he's got Catholic children that he have to kill, which wasn't true. The sons of Gonta were fighting with him against the Poles during the uprising of Haidamaki. But the Shevchenko, he have to find this tragic moment, because as a great author, he have to put the lenses and to concentrate the idea in that situation. This is back again to the World of Darkness. In World of Darkness, you mostly play to lose in various situations. And this notion of being on the shorter side of things at the end, everything, it can be related to this. And in Poland, it's maybe not in such quantity, but also there is this notion, mostly in the history of the 20th century, to get we won the Second World War technically, but gain absolutely nothing from that. And it is the notion that play to lose is the way to embrace that historical or national experience.
I think that definitely there is a niche or a place for very strong and emotional and dramatic games that could be played in the historical settings if done right, of course. Like there is, if you will take a look at a number of historical periods, you will see all of those opportunities that you could play. And as you were saying, right, the notion of you're playing to lose, how things will end up, and it will be bad for you, but that's part of the catharsis that you are getting in the end, right? So yeah, definitely it's possible to do that, but again, not to entertain, but maybe to respect or to embrace these things.
Yes, because the important thing is that the RPGs are the part of culture. That they are not worse than for example, books, literature. They can produce histories that are as good, and maybe they are better because you can feel the part of them. So this is the important thing for me, that you can relate to that, somehow relive that. And if we got a lot of historical literature, we can also have a historical but made in the proper way RPGs, and that's all I think. Because it's not an inferior form of, let's call it art, be so artsy fartsy and useless, but it's not an inferior art to the, I don't know, film industry or the literature.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, as we were saying, the industry, the hobby and the scene and the community is in a fetus stage in Ukraine. And I guess there is this whole uncharted territory for different genres to try and to play and to write games. And if someday, some people will start writing the historical RPGs, definitely in historical settings. And yeah, I hope that someday I will see those games that will tell the stories regarding those dramatic and turbulent periods of time, about the history of this land. Yeah, that would be awesome. And I would love people with knowledge of history to do that. Yeah.
And so maybe that your platform will be the platform for them to help them or
Oh,
to see.
if someone will bring, a game or a story game, not even the role playing game, but a story game would also work. If someone will bring some kind of content regarding that, of course, yeah, definitely yes.
Okay, so we will go to the question. How would the TTRPG scene in Ukraine look next year or 2 years? How do you think it will
Mm,
everything sort out with the hobby? We are also, of course we got these political problems, and we're hoping that they will
yeah.
end as soon as possible. So, in the best scenario, how do you think that this whole scene will look in the year or in the 2 years from now?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there definitely, and I'm sure about that, there definitely will be localization and translations of some of the mainstream games. And I hope to see Call of Cthulhu. I hope to see, I don't know, maybe something else like
World of
maybe even
Darkness.
World of Darkness game. Yeah, why not? Like V5. Yeah, why not? Maybe something will be happening or will start happening regarding the license for the Dungeons and Dragons. Would be great to see that. Or with all of these like OGL kind of shenanigans that happened recently, right? Maybe some other things like Pathfinder, or I don't know, maybe something else will also have more attention, and maybe the translation. So yeah, I hope to see more translations of the like mainstream games. Maybe some of the free league games would be great to see. Tales from the Loop or Vazen or I don't know, Morgborg or anything else like Mutant, right?
Yes.
Maybe Modifius, like
Mm.
2D20 games. Yeah, why not? So yeah, I would love to see those translations first of all. Then I would love to see more events happening, like conventions. Of course, with the war happening, I'm not sure about the offline events, but I would love to see RPG only focused events because we've done that with a channel and we got one. Yeah, there was one convention that we've done, and it was happening in Uzhgorod, and like for the local thing in the most western part of Ukraine, where you need to have a train that goes for 15 hours from Kiev to get to Uzhgorod. People were going there from Kiev, from Kharkiv, from other cities, and we've ended up with something like 150 visitors, which is like wow for first time small RPG only event. It was a lot. So yeah, it was a blast, and I would love to see not I'm not talking about big things, but small local, like a family kind of events, right? Would be great to see. And yeah, I would love to have some online events because that's more doable at this situation, of course. And actually there's one that will be happening. It's not for the Ukrainian audience. It's made by Ukrainian gamers for Western audience to basically let them know about the Ukraine and the situation and the community. And because, there will be a lot of speakers who are role players and gamers, and they are also on the front lines. So, yeah, that would be an interesting event. Or volunteers who are helping, both civilians and military with like things that they can help them with, right? So, and then there will be people who are building these like programs basically for they want to use role-playing games, or they're already using role-playing games as a therapy for people with PTSD. And it's not only for military. It's we have this unique case where in the Western world PTSD is mostly referred to or associated with professional military that go overseas, have some fights there, and then seeing some bad things happening there, and then going back and now trying to do something with that trauma, right? And here we have unique thing where like 10-year-old kid could have a military related PTSD where, they've seen like rockets falling in their backyard. And it's crazy, right? So yeah, there are people who are professionally building this program to use role-playing games to treat PTSD, and both for civilians and military. And there are professional, say, like people with a professional
Yes.
with a degree
Mhm.
and psychology who are taking part in that. Also, they are getting some help and training from the same organization in States, where like former military like officers are actually role players, and with help of, again, like specialists, they're building these like events to help treat PTSD. So anyway, I hope to see maybe something like that, like these like art therapy sessions maybe happening, where role-playing games could be used for good, which is always a great thing. I would love to see more public events and maybe, some even maybe streams or games where more or less public people or, known people are playing role-playing games to bring some attention to the hobby, or maybe some charity events, donations, things like that. Yeah, so I'm not sure that all of these could happen in upcoming year or two, but I would say that it takes probably 5 years to build a strong community and active community. And I'm talking from my experience with the channel, because when we started, there was literally nothing. I mean, in a public sphere, right, in the whole post-Soviet Union. So yeah, and we kind of did it, and I think that it's doable here too. And I want to believe that in 5 years, more enthusiasts will start building something. They will start building the communities. They will start I don't know, like publishing games. They will start streaming games, and there will be some quality streams, Twitch streams or YouTube games. We already have some of the channels, but it's, again, it's a fetus stage, as I was saying. Like, you will have a video with like, I don't know, like 50, 100 views, which is a pity, right? But I hope that things will change in upcoming years. So yeah, yeah. And of course, Ukrainian made role-playing games to appear, of course, yeah.
And there is any, because you're talking about the indie scene, about the games. Are there any mainline ambitions games to be published? Maybe not now, because of course the times are the times, but before for example, before the invasion.
I guess people are very realistic regarding that. At least those who are starting building their own games, they understand the scale, right, of things, and they're very realistic regarding that. And probably the only one who is potentially aiming there, and maybe not, that's not the intention, but probably he will end up there, and I hope he will end up there, is that guy who's doing this Architectica, like gentlemanish conspiracy game, because it deserves to be mainstream, because 600 pages in a book, it's a lot, and I hope all of this effort that he put into the game will be repaid. So yeah.
Okay, so we'll be finishing slowly. Do you want to say anything more to our viewers, maybe to the Polish community as you get to know it slowly?
Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely. I think that when the possibility will be there, and when the finally events will start happening, like Ukrainian events, offline, online, doesn't matter, I would love to see gamers from Poland visiting. And now with this whole situation, and how people in Ukraine now have like a lot of sympathy for Poland, like despite all of the historical problems that countries and nations had, now there is a lot of sympathy for Poland in general and for Poles. So the events will be planned and built to be inviting, right, for people visiting or taking part. And I with all of the history of tabletop role playing scene in Poland, I'm very and I'm telling it from the good side, right? I'm very envious for you guys having this long history and tradition in role playing games, right? And when I've seen like, let's say, all of the Free Liga stuff is translated, I was like, damn, that's good, right? Because One Ring second edition, it just barely came out, and here you go, you have a translation, like you have the starter sets in the shops.
But it's
Perfect.
only
Then
for
all of the
this time is only for, I don't know, the year or two. We got the resurgence, the wake up in the 2017, and we're still going to try to be in the line with the West, and it's
but you've got it.
Yeah.
You got it, and that's what's important. And also the Call of Cthulhu level of involvement, it's just astonishing. I mean, the number of the books that are translated, and then I know there are books with adventures that are written by the creators from Poland.
Yes.
About that, I know about the whole publishing that is doing all of the Call of Cthulhu stuff, like one-on-one scenarios and things like that, and located in Poland. I don't know. I don't remember the name of the publishers.
Games.
Like
Black Monk Games.
Yes.
They got they published the One Ring, also Mothership. That is interesting that they got Mothership in Poland. Crazy. So, and the Free League games, they got Tales of the Loop and the Things from the Flood. It's by them and Weizen.
Okay.
And Weizen.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, with having all of this, and you guys went through all of this, right? You have the history, you have the tradition, and it's basically you have so much to share with this young community that is building up right now. And I think it would be super valuable and like very helpful for this young community to get some guidance from you guys.
So what we can wish ourselves to get to that moment quickly, as quickly as it's possible, because and to just think about the RPGs, about the events, about the relation with the communities. Because, for example, your channel, this Wieczornie Kości, it was on the Polish basis, it would be the biggest channel with this number of subscribers. There is no RPG orientated channel in Poland. I know there is Baniak. Baniaka is the biggest. He plays only sessions, and I don't know how many 30,000 of subscribers, and you got before everything started, you get 50,000.
50,000. Yeah.
And the number of the people who were watching that is so. You also have something to show us, and the production value of that material was for me, it was astonishing, because it was just like the things from the West, from United States, for example. The studio and everything, the value of quality of sounds, it was a great job, and for me it was I just want to get to the Russian language, and I feel in Russian, and I said, it's strange, and I found it's from Ukraine.
Yeah.
It was, for me, I think this channel was really a great part of the internet for me, and that you get the these mainstream sessions, and at the same you can those formats with the systems and everything. There was this podcast for 1 hour. I was getting more news from you than, for example, from some English language channels. You got some, from my perspective, sooner than them, and that was well. For example, I don't know, the Dune 2020, and they said, and all my knowledge was from your material. So you also have something to share with us, I think.
If there will be a chance to talk about that and to help someone build something like a channel, or help with a technical side, or just to tell, how we were doing that. And guys, these are the mistakes. You shouldn't do this. It's a mistake. No, God, please, no. If I could share my knowledge and my experience, I will gladly do that. Of course. Yeah. And thank you. Yeah. We were, for a lot of us, it was a second job basically, because when streams the games, and I had this conversation with one of the former subscribers, and we were talking about how the streams the games that we were playing, and people were watching them, of course, quality, technical side of things, the storytelling, it's all great, and people understand that, yeah, probably it's hard to do and there is a lot of effort into that. But then we're talking about how those videos on YouTube are just a tip of the iceberg, in terms of how much effort and work was actually behind that to be able to build it. Because every Friday, instead of, going having a beer, we were getting in our studio, getting together and doing a proper, like a planning session where we were sitting at work in the office and, saying, okay, so we have these and these plans, so we need to do that and that. And okay, Vanya, what about merch? Or, like a Dennis, okay, what about that background that we need to build for that stream, right? So there was a lot of work there, and buying clothes in a stocks or secondhand shops for the like the assets, right? For the videos, for the teasers, trailers, all of that. It was crazy, like how much work we were doing, and it wasn't paying off at all. But yeah, it was like a pure passion for a lot of us, and so
yeah. So what can we say? More passion. It will help.
Yeah.
And solve many of the problems of hobby. So again, it was a blast for me, our interview. I get to know a lot of things. So I'm very glad that I had occasion to talk to you. So thank you. And we'll see, it's this channel that you see is Polishing RPGs, but we also want to invite you, and I want to invite you a Polish speaking channel when we are looking at maybe some more analytic view on RPGs for those who watching a new Polish language. And I will say that from the deep of my heart, that I want to these all problems of Ukraine to end as soon as possible, because it's important for every people to just have a chance to live a peaceful and normal life and play RPGs if they like to. So thank you, Sasha, for being here and for telling us. And I think that all the viewers will be very interested and will think that they get to know something better and to get something that they didn't know before they started to watch this. Thanks.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you.